Okay, so what we're going to look at today is a couple of different ways in which we can create terrains in 3ds Max that we can as well import into Unreal Engine or use within 3ds Max. We can have it a super high res version, or we can keep a low poly version. You can use this for both. So yeah, the first technique I'm going to use is kind of a more of a manual way. All the terrains, we're going to build them from starting with a plane. So if I just draw out a plane here, center that, and get rid of my grid. You can toggle the grid on and off with the G key. Scale, again, is going to be kind of down to you. At the moment, I'm just going to use default parameters. You know, you guys can look into the scale as well for what you need. So we'll ignore that for now. What we do want to look at, though, is these segments. So I'm going to turn on edge faces so I can see the segments I have so far. And this is where the kind of low poly or high res is going to come into play, because the higher you crank these up, so if I crank these up to like 20 by 20, then the higher res your terrain is going to be. All right, now I want this to be quite a bit bigger perhaps. And I want to go maybe 50 by 50, which for a terrain is still very much low poly. Okay, so just keeping it quite small for now. Obviously, the scale again is going to depend on what you need this for. So I'm going to right-click this and convert it into an editable poly now. And I'm going to go to vertex. And then when we're in vertex mode, we can see every single vertex that is making up this plane with all of the individual polygons on. And you know, I mean, at this point, you could, if you really wanted to be super manual, you could come in and move every single vertex up and down dependent on where you needed it to be for your terrain. And if you really came into a part where you were going to be really specific, you know, you could do that, or you might want to do that, but certainly at the beginning anyway, you're not going to want to do it in that way. So what you can also do, if I come over to another section, is if I come over to here in vertex mode and I come to soft selection, you could turn on soft selection, and already I can see there's some coloration going on around the vertex I have selected. That is the amount of fall off, or the fall off effect. If I crank this up, you're better off clicking and dragging your mouse up to do that. You can see the effect widens depending on how much fall off you have. So say you come to around here, if I crank that one vertex up now, see how its area of effect is kind of spread. Okay, and then depending on what you want, you can get sort of different vertices, and you can quite quickly build up this sort of some kind of terrain. And if you don't want it to be so quite so smooth, you can turn down that area of effect, whatever it is you might need to do. Okay, there's very much a kind of manual way to change the landscape there. Okay, it's got a little hill. All right, not much there. So let's try something else. Let's create another plane over here, about the same size. That should be fine. And we're going to use a different way of creating a terrain now, and that's with something called a displacement map. So to get one of those, I'm going to go over to Google, and you can see I've already searched for displacement map. And this is the kind of stuff that you get, and actually you don't necessarily really get much that's going to be very usable. You can see an example here, I suppose, of the kind of result you can get from a displacement map, but that isn't a displacement map itself. So if you're searching for a displacement map, you might want to type in displacement map terrain. Okay, now we're getting somewhere with what we've got here. So if I load up, what's a good example? Let's look at the very first example here, this displacement map here. So you can see it's made up of black and white, so grayscale coloration, and the black areas are going to be the areas that stay down low, and the whiter areas are the areas that get lifted up high in that Z-axis. So you can tell from this displacement map it would be sort of like a like a canyon, I suppose, going through there with high up mountain peaks around it. All right. So another one over here, look, which has got lots of different detailing in here. We've got like kind of a big mountain area in the middle there. Because that was really high, the white areas, and then some darker areas around it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to save this as an image. Do I want that? Is that going to work for me? A PNG. Let's try it. Not all file types work as displacement maps, so I'm going to save that one and come over to 3ds Max. So I'm going to apply that displacement map to this plane. So I'm going to go over to my Modify tab, and in the Modify list, I'm going to add, don't add, there's a couple of different ones for displacement. There's this one called Displace Mesh. You don't want that one. You want to come down and you just want the one that's called Displace. I'm going to add that on. And then here's an area where we can add a bitmap. So I'm going to select that and I'm going to find, yeah, there's the one that I downloaded. Open that up. And here's where we find out if it works with a PNG. So you can see when I've added it, nothing's happened. But if I come up here to the strength, I can click and increase that and I can tell it's working already. And it is using that displacement map information to form that terrain. And there you go, instantly we've got, so remember that really white area that was around in the middle here, has lifted up right there, and you've got, you know, quite a nice little bit of terrain that you could easily bring that into a game engine and you make use of that instantly. But what I want to do is to show you the kind of the difference between low poly, and this would be quite low poly, and a high poly version. So I'm going to create another plane about a similar size, and this time I'm going to crank this up to about, should we do a super high res, shall we, 500? Maybe not 500, 250 by 250. So you can see that's made up of loads of polygons there. Convert that to an editable poly again. Add on our displace modifier. Add the same bitmap. And let's crank up the strength here. There we go. And crank that up to around about the same height. Let's make these all the same color because that's throwing me off. There we go. And obviously at this point, there's so many edges that it's hard to see the mesh properly. So let's turn off our edge faces. There we go. So look at the detailing in there, that high res one. It looks like there's an odd part of the image there, which is screwed that up. But you can see the detailing is much, much higher in this one. Absolutely loads of detail compared to this lower poly one. So really it kind of depends what you're going to be using this for, and if it's for a game you want to try and make it as lower poly as possible. But there you go, and then obviously if I come back to this guy here in the middle, I think it's more usable. You can, once you've got the displacement map applied, you could convert this back down to an editable poly again, go to our vertices, turn on our soft selection, and then we can, you know, if you wanted to then modify that, you know, you've got a good displacement map, but you're like, oh, I wanted it to be a bit better over here, you know, you can customize it there. All right. One thing that's also useful, if I just quickly show you, if we crank this up and lower this down, some people might want to add like a surface of water. So if you kind of just lower the terrain down, what you can then do is just get another plane. That's the super high res one still, so lower that down. And you basically just kind of lower it to the height of where the waterline would be. And obviously you would have a material for water on there. But yeah, then you would have kind of a surface of water going in there. And then, you know, obviously materials is going to completely change the way that this looks. But for the 3D model wise, there's a couple of different ways in which you can really quickly make some nice terrains. So as a last kind of comment with these displacement maps, there's plenty of ones available online, but also depending on your Photoshop skills, I suppose, You could create your own canvas in Photoshop, maybe make the whole canvas black to start off with, and then different kind of grayscale tones with different types of brushes. You could build your own displacement map and bring that into 3ds Max as well. Okay, so that'll about do it for terrains.